I once heard that the strongest hearts are not the ones that never break, but the ones that quietly choose to love again. Snow drifted gently across the streets of Denver as daylight slowly surrendered to a gray winter evening. Small businesses along the neighborhood blocks switched on warm lights one by one, inviting weary customers inside while the cold wind swept through nearly empty sidewalks. At the corner of Maple Street stood a modest home repair workshop with a weathered wooden sign that simply read Morgan Home Repair. Inside, Caleb Morgan tightened the final bolt on an old rocking chair before wiping his hands with a clean cloth. His dark brown hair was neatly combed despite a long day of work, and the lines around his masculine face reflected years of responsibility more than age. He glanced toward the clock hanging above the workbench and smiled quietly. Grace would be waiting for him at home, probably finishing her homework while trying not to burn the grilled cheese sandwiches she insisted on making whenever he worked late. Caleb carefully locked away his tools before hearing the soft sound of tires stopping outside the shop. A sleek black luxury sedan came to a halt beside the curb, its polished exterior looking strangely out of place in the quiet neighborhood. The driver's door remained closed for several seconds before the rear passenger door slowly opened. A woman stepped out wearing an elegant white wool coat over a tailored white business suit. Snowflakes settled gently onto her chestnut brown hair as she looked toward the workshop with an expression that carried both determination and exhaustion. Caleb assumed she had mistaken his shop for another business. Wealthy clients rarely visited this part of town, and those who did usually needed furniture repaired rather than life-changing conversations. He opened the front door with a polite smile. "Good evening. We are about to close, but if something needs fixing, I will gladly take a look tomorrow morning." The woman walked closer, her calm eyes never leaving his. "Are you Caleb Morgan?" she asked softly. "Yes." She took one slow breath before answering. "My name is Abigail Reed." Caleb recognized the name immediately. Even someone who rarely followed business news knew the face of the billionaire chief executive officer whose company had transformed Denver's skyline over the past decade. He looked around instinctively, expecting security personnel or assistants to appear behind her, but she had arrived completely alone. "Mrs. Reed," he said respectfully, "I think you may have the wrong address." Abigail offered a faint smile that barely concealed how tired she truly felt. "No, I spent 3 days making certain I had the right one." Caleb frowned with quiet confusion. "Then how can I help you?" For several long seconds, she simply looked at him, as though searching for the courage to say words that had never belonged in the vocabulary of one of the country's most powerful women. Finally, her voice became almost a whisper. "I need you to marry me." The silence inside the workshop became so complete that even the ticking wall clock seemed louder than before. Caleb stared at her, convinced he had misunderstood. "I am sorry." Abigail lowered her eyes briefly before meeting his gaze once again. "I know how impossible this sounds. I know you have every reason to say no. But if you do not agree to become my husband, everything my father spent his life building will be taken from me tomorrow morning." Caleb remained completely still, unable to find a single word. He had expected a broken chair, a damaged cabinet, perhaps even a donation request for a community project. He had never imagined that the woman standing in front of him, surrounded by quiet snowfall and unimaginable success, would arrive carrying a proposal that sounded less like romance and more like the final plea of someone who had already run out of hope. Caleb Morgan stood silently beside his workbench while the snow continued falling outside, wondering whether the remarkable woman standing before him had simply reached the limits of exhaustion. Abigail Reed did not look like someone making a reckless decision. She looked like someone carrying the weight of an entire world alone. Caleb slowly pulled out a wooden chair from beside his repair table. "Please sit down," he said gently. "I think there is more to this story than one sentence can explain." Abigail accepted the chair with quiet gratitude. For a moment, she simply warmed her hands around the cup of coffee Caleb had poured from the old pot he kept near the workbench. The humble workshop smelled of fresh pine, machine oil, and cinnamon from a small candle Grace had insisted made the place feel friendlier. Abigail looked around the room, noticing framed photographs hanging above the shelves. Most showed Caleb smiling beside a little girl through different seasons of life. One photograph included a woman with kind eyes standing between them. Caleb noticed her gaze resting there, but said nothing. Abigail finally took a slow breath. My father built Reed Holdings from a single construction crew, she began softly. Before he passed away, he wrote one unusual condition into his estate documents. He believed a leader responsible for thousands of families should understand the meaning of having one of her own. Caleb listened without interrupting. The agreement states that before the annual board confirmation vote, the chief executive officer must demonstrate stable family leadership. If I cannot satisfy that requirement, temporary executive authority transfers to my father's longtime business partner until the board decides otherwise. Caleb frowned thoughtfully. And that partner wants your position? Abigail nodded. Preston Vale has spent months convincing the board that I care more about business than people. If he gains control, he will dismantle everything my father believed this company should represent. Caleb looked toward the workshop window where snowflakes drifted beneath the streetlights. Why me? Abigail reached into her handbag and carefully placed a folder on the table. Inside were newspaper articles, community newsletters, and photographs. Caleb recognized himself repairing playground equipment, helping neighbors rebuild after a storm, coaching children's baseball games, and volunteering at a local shelter. I hired investigators, Abigail admitted quietly. Not because I wanted someone wealthy or influential. I wanted someone whose character could survive public attention. Caleb looked uncomfortable. You investigated my life? Only the parts already known by your community. Abigail answered honestly. Every person I interviewed told me the same thing. They said you never help people because someone is watching. You help because you believe it is the right thing to do. Caleb closed the folder gently. You could find many good men. Abigail shook her head. Not many who would protect a stranger's reputation before protecting their own. Silence settled between them once again. Caleb's eyes drifted toward the family photograph on the wall. My wife passed away 4 years ago, he said quietly. Since then, my entire world has been my daughter. I promised myself I would never make decisions that confused her or made her question what family means. Abigail lowered her eyes with genuine understanding. I am not asking you to replace anyone. I would never ask that. Just then the workshop door opened, letting in another rush of cold air. 8-year-old Grace hurried inside wearing her winter coat, carrying her backpack almost as large as she was. She smiled the moment she saw her father, then politely looked toward the elegant stranger sitting nearby. Abigail stood immediately and returned the smile with quiet kindness. Grace studied her for only a moment before asking the innocent question neither adult expected. Daddy, why does she look like she has been carrying something too heavy all by herself? Grace's innocent question lingered in the quiet workshop far longer than either adult expected. Abigail lowered her eyes, and for the first time since entering the small building, the confident chief executive officer seemed unable to find an answer. Caleb smiled gently at his daughter. Sometimes grown-ups carry worries that nobody else can see. Grace slowly nodded before walking toward Abigail with the natural kindness that only children seemed able to offer without hesitation. My teacher says heavy things become lighter when someone helps carry them. Abigail felt a small smile appear despite the exhausting day. Your teacher sounds very wise. Grace shrugged playfully. She gives a lot of homework too. The simple joke filled the workshop with quiet laughter, dissolving a tension that expensive boardrooms had failed to break for months. Caleb watched the exchange silently. Throughout the years after losing his wife, Grace had developed an unusual ability to recognize loneliness in other people. She rarely judged anyone by appearance, only by the sadness she sensed behind their smiles. Abigail looked around the modest workshop once more. Every shelf had been built by hand. Every tool rested neatly in its place. Nothing was luxurious, yet everything reflected care. She realized that this small building contained something no executive office had offered her in years: peace. Caleb finally spoke. I appreciate your honesty, Abigail, but I cannot make a decision tonight. She nodded immediately. I would not expect you to. He looked toward the family photograph hanging above the workbench. When my wife passed away, I promised Grace that our home would always be built on truth. I cannot pretend to love someone simply because circumstances demand it. Abigail met his eyes calmly. I am not asking for that. She reached into her briefcase and removed a single envelope instead of another legal document. This is not a contract. It is simply an explanation of everything that is happening, including the estate clause, the board meeting, and the timeline. Read it only if you choose to. Caleb accepted the envelope without opening it. Thank you. Abigail stood and buttoned her white winter coat before quietly walking toward the door. Snow continued falling outside, covering the sidewalks in a blanket of white. Before leaving, she paused one last time. Whether your answer is yes or no, I hope you never lose the kindness that made me come here in the first place. Caleb nodded respectfully. I hope you find the help you need. After the luxury sedan disappeared into the snowy evening, Grace looked up at her father with thoughtful eyes. She was not pretending. Caleb remained silent. I know, he answered softly. Together they drove home through the quiet streets of Denver. Their small house welcomed them with familiar warmth, the scent of tomato soup still lingering from the slow cooker Grace had prepared before school. During dinner, neither of them mentioned marriage. They talked about homework, the neighborhood Christmas lights, and the bird feeder outside the kitchen window. Yet later that night, after Grace had fallen asleep, Caleb sat alone at the dining table beneath a single lamp. The unopened envelope rested beside an old framed photograph of his late wife. He stared at both for a long time. One represented a promise he had made to the past. The other represented a stranger asking him to protect her future. Outside, the snow continued falling without making a sound, while inside the quiet house, a widowed father slowly realized that the hardest decisions in life are never between right and wrong. They are between holding on to yesterday and finding the courage to face tomorrow. The following morning arrived beneath a clear winter sky, and Caleb Morgan found himself driving toward the Denver courthouse with emotions he had not expected to face again. The unopened envelope from Abigail Reed had become an open truth during the quiet hours before sunrise. Every document inside confirmed her story. The estate clause was real. The emergency board vote was scheduled for the following afternoon. If nothing changed, Preston Vale would assume temporary control of Reed Holdings and begin dismantling the values Abigail's father had spent a lifetime protecting. Caleb had spent the entire night thinking not only about Abigail, but also about the kind of example he wanted Grace to remember. He had always taught her that helping someone did not require understanding every outcome. Sometimes it only required the courage to do what was right. Grace sat quietly beside him in the truck, looking out at the snow-covered streets. After several minutes, she smiled gently. You decided to help her. Caleb kept his eyes on the road. I decided that your mother taught me something I should never forget. Grace looked at him curiously. What was that? Caleb smiled with quiet gratitude. Real love is not afraid to help someone, even when it does not receive anything in return. When they arrived at the courthouse, Abigail was already waiting outside beneath the stone columns, dressed in a graceful white winter coat over an elegant white business suit. Despite the calm expression on her face, Caleb could see she had barely slept. She stepped forward slowly, almost afraid to ask the question waiting between them. Caleb met her eyes and answered before she spoke. I will help you. Abigail closed her eyes for a brief moment, relieved beyond words. Thank you. Caleb raised one hand gently. But I have one condition. She nodded immediately. Anything. He looked toward Grace, standing quietly beside him. No matter what happens during this agreement, my daughter comes first. She will never be used for publicity, business strategy, or appearances. She deserves honesty, stability, and kindness. Abigail looked directly at Grace before answering with complete sincerity. You have my word. Grace smiled softly, sensing that the promise had come from the heart rather than obligation. A courthouse clerk welcomed them inside. There were no photographers, no reporters, no elaborate decorations. Only a simple courtroom, a judge, 2 legal witnesses, and 3 people choosing responsibility over comfort. The ceremony lasted less than 15 minutes. They exchanged plain wedding bands provided by the clerk, repeated traditional vows with respectful sincerity, and quietly signed the marriage certificate. When the judge congratulated them, neither Caleb nor Abigail pretended they had become husband and wife in the ordinary sense. Instead, they had become partners carrying the same burden for different reasons. As they stepped outside into the bright winter sunlight, Abigail looked toward Caleb with quiet gratitude. I know this cannot erase your past, she said softly. Caleb glanced at the ring now resting on his hand. It is not meant to. He smiled gently. This marriage is about protecting your future, not replacing my memories. Abigail accepted those words without disappointment because she understood the dignity behind them. Grace walked between them, slipping one small hand into Caleb's and the other into Abigail's without saying a word. For a brief moment, the three of them crossed the courthouse steps together beneath falling snow, looking less like strangers bound by paperwork and more like people beginning a journey none of them had expected. Far across the city, inside the executive offices of Reed Holdings, Preston Vale received confirmation that the marriage certificate had been officially filed. His confident smile slowly disappeared. The obstacle he believed impossible had quietly become reality, and for the first time since he began his campaign for power, he realized Abigail Reed was no longer standing alone. 3 days after the quiet courthouse ceremony, Abigail Reed stood outside Caleb Morgan's modest home with 2 small suitcases instead of the long line of luxury vehicles that usually followed her everywhere. The winter sun reflected softly across the snow-covered neighborhood as she looked at the simple front porch with unexpected hesitation. She had spent years living inside a mansion where every room echoed with silence despite its beauty. Now she found herself wondering why a small brick house with a weathered mailbox felt warmer before she had even stepped inside. Caleb opened the front door with a welcoming smile. "Good morning." Abigail smiled back. "I hope I am not too early." Before Caleb could answer, Grace hurried into the hallway wearing fuzzy socks and a bright yellow sweater. "You came?" Abigail laughed softly. "I said I would." Grace immediately reached for one of the suitcases. "Your room is ready." Abigail blinked with surprise. "My room?" Grace nodded proudly. "Daddy painted it yesterday after I went to bed." Caleb looked slightly embarrassed. It was nothing fancy. Abigail followed them upstairs and quietly stopped in the doorway. The guest room was simple, painted a warm cream color with fresh curtains overlooking the backyard. A small vase of wildflowers rested on the nightstand even though it was the middle of winter. Grace noticed Abigail looking at them. "The flowers are not real," she admitted with a grin, "but they still make people smile." Abigail gently touched the little arrangement, feeling emotion rise unexpectedly. "They certainly do." That evening, the three of them gathered around the small wooden dining table that Caleb had built years earlier with his own hands. The meal was nothing extraordinary. Homemade chicken soup, fresh bread, roasted vegetables, and apple pie Grace insisted everyone should try even though she admitted the crust was slightly uneven. Abigail looked around the table while quiet conversation filled the room. Nobody checked stock prices. Nobody answered business calls. Nobody discussed quarterly earnings. Instead, Grace talked excitedly about school, Caleb listened with patient attention, and laughter appeared naturally without effort. Abigail realized she had attended hundreds of elegant dinners attended by governors, investors, and celebrities, yet none of them had ever made her feel as welcome as this simple meal. After dinner, Caleb automatically gathered the dishes and carried them toward the sink. Abigail stood immediately. "Let me help." Caleb smiled politely. "You are our guest." Abigail gently shook her head. "I am your wife in public. I can certainly wash dishes in private." Grace giggled. "Daddy washes. I dry. You can put everything away." Without another word, the three of them quietly worked together in the warm kitchen. Outside, snowflakes drifted beneath the porch light, while inside the gentle sound of running water mixed with relaxed conversation. When the last plate had been placed in the cabinet, Abigail noticed a framed photograph resting above the fireplace. It showed Caleb standing beside his late wife, both smiling as they held baby Grace between them. Abigail walked closer, studying the picture with quiet respect. Caleb joined her after a moment. "She was the kindest person I ever knew," he said softly. Abigail never looked away from the photograph. "I can tell." There was no jealousy in her voice, only admiration for someone she would never meet. Caleb appreciated that more than she realized. Later that night, Abigail sat alone in the guest room looking out across the peaceful neighborhood. For the first time in many years, the silence surrounding her no longer felt empty. Downstairs, she could hear Caleb reminding Grace to brush her teeth before bed, followed by the little girl's laughter echoing through the hallway. Abigail smiled quietly to herself. She had entered this house believing she was borrowing a husband to save a company. She never expected that a modest home, a devoted father, and an honest little girl would begin showing her the family she had spent her entire life searching for without even knowing it. 1 week later, the annual board confirmation meeting filled the executive headquarters of Reed Holdings with an atmosphere that felt more like a courtroom than a business conference. Directors, investors, and senior executives occupied every seat around the long conference table, while legal advisors quietly reviewed documents near the windows overlooking downtown Denver. Abigail Reed entered the room wearing an elegant white business suit, calm and composed despite the pressure surrounding the meeting. Caleb Morgan walked beside her in a simple navy suit, his wedding band resting naturally on his hand. He had never cared about expensive clothing or impressive offices, yet he carried himself with the same quiet dignity that had always defined him. Preston Vale greeted them with a courteous smile that failed to hide his confidence. "Good morning," he said. "I trust everyone is prepared for today's discussion." Abigail simply nodded. "We certainly are." The meeting began with financial reports, expansion plans, and company performance. Every division exceeded expectations, leaving little room for criticism. Finally, Preston folded his hands together and leaned forward. "Before we proceed with the confirmation vote, I believe the board deserves clarification regarding this recent marriage." The room became noticeably quieter. Preston looked directly toward Caleb. "Mr. Morgan, many people have expressed concern that this arrangement exists only to satisfy the estate requirement. Some have suggested you are nothing more than a convenient husband." Several directors exchanged uncertain glances while reporters quietly prepared their notebooks. Abigail started to respond, but Caleb gently placed his hand over hers beneath the table, silently asking her to let him speak. He stood calmly without raising his voice. "I understand why people have questions," he began. "My life before this meeting was spent repairing homes, raising my daughter, and helping neighbors whenever I could. I have never managed a corporation, and I have never asked anyone to believe I belong in rooms like this one." Preston smiled slightly, believing the answer supported his argument. Caleb continued, "But I also believe something important. A husband is not measured by where he works or how much he owns. A husband is measured by whether he protects the dignity of the woman standing beside him, especially when others choose not to." Complete silence settled across the boardroom. Caleb looked neither angry nor defensive. "Mrs. Reed never asked me to pretend that we shared a perfect life. She asked for my help protecting her father's legacy and the thousands of families who depend on this company. I agreed because helping someone in need has always been the way I try to live." He looked toward the directors one by one. "Whether this board confirms her leadership or not, I hope every decision made today reflects the same responsibility you would want someone to show your own family." Caleb quietly returned to his seat. No applause interrupted the stillness. None was necessary. The directors remained thoughtful, and even those who had questioned the marriage lowered their eyes in reflection. Preston glanced around the room, searching for support that no longer seemed certain. Abigail looked toward Caleb with quiet gratitude. He had defended neither himself nor the marriage contract. Instead, he had defended her character without asking for recognition. As the chairperson called for the final vote, Abigail realized that regardless of the outcome, something far more valuable had already changed. For the first time in many years, someone had stood beside her not because of her wealth, influence, or title, but because he believed protecting another person's dignity was simply the right thing to do. The board confirmed Abigail Reed as Chief Executive Officer by an overwhelming vote, and for the first time in months, the burden she had carried alone began to feel lighter. Reed Holdings returned to its work with renewed confidence, while Preston Vale quietly accepted that his plan had failed. Yet the greatest changes did not happen inside the executive offices. They happened inside a small brick house where every evening ended with dinner around the same wooden table. Winter slowly gave way to spring, and routines that had once felt temporary became wonderfully natural. Caleb Morgan continued repairing homes during the day whenever his schedule allowed, believing honest work should never be abandoned simply because life had become more comfortable. Abigail divided her time between leading the company and returning home before dinner whenever possible. Grace never questioned the unusual path that had brought them together. To her, kindness had always mattered more than explanations. One Saturday morning, Reed Holdings organized a community charity event to renovate a neighborhood youth center. Employees volunteered beside local families, painting classrooms, repairing playground equipment, and planting trees. Caleb spent the morning teaching volunteers how to install new benches while Abigail worked beside office employees with a paintbrush in her hand instead of standing behind a podium. Reporters covering the event smiled at the unexpected sight of the billionaire chief executive officer laughing alongside children covered in harmless splashes of paint. During the afternoon, families gathered for a picnic in the park beside the renovated building. Grace proudly carried a colorful drawing she had finished earlier that morning. She searched excitedly through the crowd until she found Abigail speaking with several volunteers. "I made something," Grace announced with a bright smile. Abigail knelt beside her immediately. "May I see it?" Grace handed over the drawing with both hands. It showed 3 people standing together beneath a blue sky in front of a small house. Caleb stood on one side, Abigail on the other, and Grace smiled between them while holding both of their hands. Above the picture, written in careful handwriting, were 5 simple words: "My family feels safe now." Abigail remained completely still. The cheerful conversations around them slowly faded into the background as she looked at the drawing. "It is beautiful," she whispered. Grace tilted her head innocently. "My teacher said we should draw our family." Abigail looked gently toward Caleb, who had just finished helping another volunteer carry supplies across the park. Before she could say anything, Grace spoke again with complete sincerity. "I told everyone you are my stepmom." Caleb stopped walking the moment he heard those words. Abigail's eyes filled with quiet emotion, not because of the title itself, but because she realized Grace had never been asked to use it. The little girl had chosen it on her own. Caleb slowly approached them, unsure what to say. Grace looked up at both adults with complete confidence. "Families are the people who stay," she said softly. "And both of you stay." Neither Caleb nor Abigail answered immediately. Some truths become too meaningful for quick replies. Abigail carefully folded the drawing and held it close to her heart, as though it were the most valuable document she had ever received. Caleb smiled gently, realizing that somewhere between a courthouse promise and countless ordinary evenings around a dinner table, something had quietly changed. What had begun as an agreement built on responsibility was slowly becoming a home built on trust, and neither of them could remember the exact moment when pretending had quietly disappeared and genuine belonging had taken its place. Late one evening after Grace had fallen asleep, the house settled into the peaceful silence that always followed a busy day. Soft rain tapped gently against the kitchen window while a single lamp filled the living room with warm golden light. Caleb Morgan remained downstairs, organizing a few old family photographs before placing them carefully into a wooden box he rarely opened. Abigail Reed walked quietly into the room, carrying 2 cups of herbal tea. She noticed the open box resting beside him and hesitated before speaking. "May I sit here?" Caleb nodded with a gentle smile. "Of course." She handed him one of the cups before taking the seat across from him. Neither of them hurried to fill the silence. Over the past several months, they had learned that comfortable silence often revealed more truth than endless conversation. Abigail's eyes rested on an aged envelope tucked beneath the photographs. Its edges had yellowed with time, and Caleb instinctively reached toward it before stopping his own hand. Abigail looked at him with quiet concern. "You have never opened that letter." Caleb slowly shook his head. "It was given to me after my wife passed away. She wrote it during her final days and asked that I read it only when I was ready." Abigail listened without interrupting. Caleb lowered his eyes. "I kept telling myself that if I never opened it, then somehow I was still protecting the life we had together." His voice remained calm, but the years of hidden sorrow could still be heard beneath every word. "I was afraid that reading her last message would mean saying goodbye forever." Abigail gently folded her hands together. "Do you believe she wanted you to stay trapped in that moment?" Caleb looked toward the rain outside the window. "No. Then why have you carried this weight alone for so long?" He smiled sadly. "Because loving someone that deeply changes you forever. I worried that if I allowed myself to love again, I would somehow betray the memory of the woman who gave me grace." Abigail's eyes filled with quiet compassion. She moved her chair slightly closer, but never crossed the respectful space between them. "Love does not erase love," she said softly. "A grateful heart is capable of honoring yesterday while still embracing tomorrow. One blessing never steals another." Caleb remained silent as her words settled gently into the room. Abigail continued with a calm voice. I have never wanted to replace anyone. The woman who shared your life will always be part of your family. Grace carries her smile every single day. Nothing can change that. Caleb slowly looked at her, surprised by the peace in her expression. There was no jealousy, no insecurity, only understanding. Abigail smiled gently. The heart does not become smaller because it heals. It simply becomes strong enough to carry more gratitude. At that moment, Grace quietly appeared at the top of the staircase, rubbing her sleepy eyes after waking from a dream. "Daddy." Caleb immediately stood. "Everything is all right, sweetheart." Grace walked downstairs and wrapped her arms around him before looking at Abigail. "I dreamed Mommy was smiling." Caleb felt emotion rise inside him. "Did she say anything?" Grace nodded gently. "She said we should not be afraid to be happy." The room became completely still. No one questioned the innocence of a child's dream. Grace kissed her father's cheek before returning upstairs, leaving Caleb and Abigail sitting together beneath the warm light once again. Caleb looked down at the unopened envelope resting beside his hand. For the first time in 4 years, he did not see it as a reminder of everything he had lost. Instead, he began to wonder whether it might become permission to live the life his late wife had always hoped he would one day find. Exactly 1 year after they had quietly signed a simple marriage certificate inside the Denver courthouse, Caleb Morgan stood alone on the front porch before sunrise holding the unopened letter that had rested in his wooden box for 4 long years. The morning air was cool, and the first golden light slowly reached across the quiet neighborhood. Inside the house, Grace and Abigail were still asleep, unaware that Caleb had finally found the courage to face the one memory he had carried longer than his grief. He carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the neatly written pages. His late wife's handwriting immediately brought tears to his eyes, but as he continued reading, those tears slowly became peaceful rather than painful. She had written about Grace, about hope, and about the future she knew she would never see. Near the end of the letter, one sentence quietly changed everything. "If someone kind ever finds their way into your life after I am gone, promise me you will not close the door because of me." Love is never divided. It simply grows large enough to carry more people. Caleb lowered the letter and closed his eyes as the weight he had carried for years finally began to disappear. A few moments later, he heard the front door open behind him. Abigail stepped onto the porch wearing a simple white sweater instead of one of her elegant business suits, holding 2 warm cups of coffee. She smiled gently when she noticed the opened letter resting in his hands. "You finally read it." Caleb nodded slowly. "I think she knew me better than I knew myself." Abigail sat beside him without asking another question. The silence between them felt peaceful, as though neither of them needed to explain what their hearts already understood. Later that afternoon, the family returned to the same courthouse where everything had first begun. Caleb had quietly asked Abigail to meet him there without telling her why. Grace skipped happily across the familiar steps while carrying a small bouquet of white flowers she had picked from the garden that morning. Abigail looked at Caleb with gentle curiosity. "Why are we here?" Caleb reached into his jacket pocket and removed 2 folded documents. Abigail immediately recognized them as the divorce papers their attorneys had prepared months earlier according to the original agreement. Caleb looked at them for a long moment before smiling peacefully. Without saying a word, he slowly tore both copies into small pieces and let them fall into a nearby recycling container. Abigail stared at him in complete surprise. Caleb then took her hands in his. "1 year ago I married you because you needed someone to protect your future. Somewhere along the way, you quietly protected mine." Tears filled Abigail's eyes. Caleb continued softly. "You never asked me to forget my past. You simply helped me believe that my heart was allowed to live again. I thought I was saving your life, but you healed mine." Abigail smiled through quiet tears before removing the simple wedding band she had worn every day. Caleb looked confused until she gently placed it back into his hand. "Last year this ring represented a promise written on paper," she whispered. "Will you place it on my hand again, because this time you truly choose me?" Caleb smiled with a peace he had not felt in years. He slipped the ring back onto her finger, not as part of an agreement, but as the beginning of the life they both genuinely wanted. Grace clapped happily before wrapping her arms around both of them at once. The 3 of them stood together beneath the bright Colorado sky while a gentle breeze carried away the last traces of yesterday's sorrow. Months later, Visitors entering the headquarters of Reed Holdings noticed a new inscription displayed beneath a family photograph in the main lobby. It read, "Character builds companies, kindness builds families, and love gives both a future." Employees often paused to read those words before beginning their day, never realizing they had been inspired by a quiet father who believed ordinary goodness was enough. It always had been. And in the end, the greatest miracle was never the marriage that saved a chief executive officer. It was the family that quietly taught two wounded hearts how to become whole again.